Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As Michael said, I'm Kira Epstein. I'm the co-director at the New School at Commonweal. Today, in collaboration with Commonweal's Cancer Choices program, we are so pleased to host Dr. Keith Block in conversation with our host, Michael Lerner, and some of the Cancer Choices team. This conversation is part of our co-presented series of conversations with the Cancer Choices program, and there are many, many recordings you can listen to. You can find all of them on both of our websites, tns.commonweal.org and cancerchoices.org, and on the New School's media pages. We have YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and SoundCloud. I'm ready to turn it over to you, Michael. Have a good conversation.
Thank you, Kira. Keith, welcome back. Such a beloved friend. We've been in the field together for close to 40 years, I think. You are the founder and medical director of the Block Center in Evanston, Illinois, or close to Evanston. And you've been doing this extraordinary work for decades, really one of the great pioneers of integrative or whole person cancer care. And so many people have now come into the field, but you remain almost without parallel among the greatest authorities. You and your wife and partner, Kenny Block, lead your team of cancer professionals that provide a different approach to cancer that emphasizes life, individualized treatment, and a multifaceted approach. And as you say on your website, the integrative cancer treatment has become almost a catchphrase, but it rarely is truly integrated. And at the Block Center, that's what you do. So it's a great honor to have you here. And I think the first question is, what is, well, let me start here. How did you end up at the Block Center, and what does the model of life over cancer look like?
You know, I got into this probably as many of you have. Cancer hit me and my family before I was born. And I had a cousin who is my aunt and uncle traveled with around the United States to different institutions and stuff, who sadly did not survive. Between my 8th and 16th birthday, I lost several relatives to cancer. My grandmother was diagnosed when I was minus 11, if you can be minus 11. And she recurred when I was 14, a full 25 years later. Yeah, cancer stem cells is my opinion, but she was robust, outspoken, and dynamic. And at the hospital, my parents brought me. She was debilitated. She was depleted. She was diminished. She was in despair, and no one dealt with her diet, her fitness, her social support, or her hope. I was a bit precocious, as you might guess, and chewed my parents out the whole way home. I'd say it's not an accident that I ended up here. So maybe that kind of answers your question in that regard. And you know, for what it's worth, integrative treatment didn't even exist in 1980 when Penny and I opened up our clinic. In fact, the word integrative wasn't even part of our lexicon. I was seeing patients from 2 different camps. Conventional patients came to see me who often were responding favorably to treatment, but struggled with adverse effects. And alternative patients, you know, were referred to me or came to me. In those days, I was deeply involved in macrobiotics, and it was fairly well known by that community. And most of those patients claimed to feel quite well, but their cancers were progressing. So I introduced complementary treatments to the conventional group and the conventional group, or the conventional care to alternative patients. And it worked. Both groups seemed to do better. Ironically, one of my most important mentors, bless his soul, Dr. Robert Mendelsohn, advised me, he says, Keith, if you stand in the middle of the road, you'll get hit by cars on both sides. So what did I do? I built a career in the middle of the road. And yep, believe me, I have been hit by cars on both sides many a time.
Absolutely.
I have learned really, virtually every day of clinical work and practice, which has really been a gift, that really from patients, the middle ground is the optimal ground. That bridging these systems together is really something that really respects the humanity of a patient, and it acknowledges the sacredness of healing and taking care of patients. And simultaneously, I believe these tools have enormous relevance, but lack a certain degree of innovation, and we'll talk about it, but kind of a multi-targeting, a pleiotropism, if you will.
And what is the life over cancer model look like? How do you describe what you do at the Block Center?
Well, let me say what I don't do first, just very quickly. What is not integrative cancer treatment is alternative medicine, defined as in lieu of conventional cancer treatment. Data demonstrates if a patient chooses a strictly alternative route, you actually see a significant increase in mortality. Even if a patient skips a single core conventional intervention, that's what people would call, the guidelines or standard of care. Even skipping one, surgery, chemo, hormonal therapy, radiation therapy, that's enough to still increase significantly mortality. So while we've all heard of a patient or two, and we all have, that went on an alternative route and recovered, after doing this for well over 40 years now, I will tell you, please make no mistake, this is the exception, not the rule. That this idea that we can disregard either one of these camps, if you will, is, in my opinion, a very serious mistake. The second part of it is CAM is also not integrative. Complementary alternative medicine is lovely. It sounds lovely. It's most often a single intervention add-on, kind of like yoga and breast cancer or green tea and prostate cancer. It may help, but it's not integrative cancer treatment. Institutions introduce single add-ons for research purposes because really it's the model. It's what the FDA wants. No confounding variables, no muddy water, simple, clean studies that you can make a claim at the end of the day. And I'll hit the other side too, independent cancer centers that will implement an add-on or two, massage, music therapy. It's very feel good. It's great in many ways from my perspective that it's a step in the right direction. It's a little clever and creative from a marketing perspective, but at the end of the day, likely it's only going to have a minimal clinical impact. It's not going to have the kind of impact that I think you can have by really augmenting the best of both worlds by bringing them together in a very systematic and comprehensive way that really respects the biology, the science, and the patient.
Yeah, we call that integrative cancer care light, like a light beer, that, on the one hand, the good news is that almost every major cancer center has some kind of integrative care program. And when you and I started, they had none. So that's the good news. They're adding. But very often, as you say, those additions are good for marketing and they make people feel good, but they really don't scratch the surface of what a true integrative program looks like.
Great.
Yeah.
So your question is kind of what does it look like?
Yeah.
And I would pick up my computer and turn around and show you my office, but everybody's gone. And I don't know if I'd get rehooked up right. And so
well, let's not do that then.
Won't do that today. But on some levels, we look more like a spa than an oncology center. We have oncology trained nurses, a medical oncology team. We have a full pharmacy. Our pharmacy does way more than mix cancer drugs. We mix a whole variety of natural products, IV, oral agents. We have a full system that's based on really three significant, what we refer to as spheres. The biographical component, who you are, how you live, how you take care of yourself, who your immediate other is, bringing all of these tools really together with a considerable amount of respect for the care and the establishment of relationships. My book, Life Over Cancer, is really a roadmap to cancer recovery, and establishing biographical integrity is really relevant. How we live, how we eat, how we take care of ourselves is fundamental. Cancer recovery demands motivation to achieve optimal wellness in really every facet of care. Some of you will remember these things maybe, but in 2005, a very famous researcher in nutrition, Klobowski, even today, patients see me and still, talk about this, that they're advised, patients will tell me that, their doctors have told them that diet doesn't matter. But he did a study that he presented in front of 5,000 people at the annual meeting for the American Society for Clinical Oncology in 2005. And there were 2,400 plus postmenopausal breast cancer patients. And if they lowered their fat to below 20%, which matches our nutritional program, there was a 24% reduction in breast cancer recurrence. That's comparable to many drugs, including tamoxifen and aromatase inhibitors. So that is not, without clinical relevance by any means. And yet, I would say nothing has changed. Even now, 18 years later, I would say that, maybe a very small handful of cancer specialists in the United States will address, not just with breast cancer, but with colon cancer, with kidney cancer, with lung cancer patients, how relevant and important the foundation of proper eating really is. Our second area, and I believe me can talk for hours on each one of these, but establishing biological integrity, if you will, or really what I would today calls the extracellular environment, getting that microenvironment optimized. You probably appreciate seed and soil. Seed and soils existed since discussions back in the Ming Dynasty, dates back thousands of years. But I think I was among the very first to put laboratory tests and a full treatment system in place to transform what I called back in the 1970s and early 80s, the biochemical and metabolic terrain. It would take 20 plus years for the pharma research oncology community to refer to it as the tumor microenvironment. But we were talking very similar with regards to things like inflammation, oxidation, glycemia, hyperinsulinemia, immune suppression, or depression, and stress chemistry, coagulopathy. Take coagulopathy. You kind of get some of you scratching your head saying, who? Coagulopathy is stickiness, blood clotting. And we know that the challenges of cancer, usually patients do not succumb from malignancy at all. In fact, it's a very rare event, but rather from complications, life-threatening complications. An example of that is blood clots that turn into moving thrombi and emboli. And so from a challenge perspective, it's really relevant to deactivate and deaggregate platelets. Well, your platelets are there to create clots. But believe it or not, your platelets, I refer to them as drills and shields. They will drill a hole from the basement membrane. Think of the basement of your house, and that you need to get into the water and gas lines. But in this case, I'm going to refer to it as the rivers of the body, your blood and lymph system. And cancer cells want to spread, and they do that by activating platelets to drill a hole. And now the cancer cells can migrate from that basement membrane into the rivers of the body. And the platelets come with them, and what the platelets then do is they act as a shield, and they actually will wall off, kind of creating, a wall around the cancer cells. And now the cancer cell can migrate through the system, find a new place to dock, and now, I guess we would use the word in science, extravate. They would actually leave the vessel and now enter tissue and find a new home. And that's how metastatic sites develop. And yet, if we give the right diet, the right control of stresses, we sleep well, we stay optimally fit, we take the right compounds, we can deactivate and deaggregate platelets, first making it harder for those cells to ever breach into the rivers of the body, and second, so that the platelets don't act as a shield, leaving the cells that do make it into the rivers of the body exposed and thus far more vulnerable in terms of cancer, killing effects from one's immune system and various lymphocytes and white blood cells and natural killer cells. So there's real evidence in varieties of ways, and I can even maybe through the talk give you some patient examples where getting the soup, if you will, this terrain, this micro environment, so it is inhospitable to cancer instead of supporting cancer. And what happens is the cancer cells and the cancer tumors will hijack the terrain for their own purposes. As a patient, we have to hijack that back. And so we do laboratory testing, very extensive laboratory testing, and we let a patient's targets tell us what to do to fix that environment so it's cancer fighting instead of cancer promoting. The third area, just to kind of close the loop a little bit on this, is moving more toward establishing a pathological resolution, if you will. What we would really today call kind of the intracellular biology. And the intracellular biology has become quite relevant. In around 1998, I took one of our research associates off of other projects, and we started working on a massive digital library because I believed at that time that we were going to be where we are today. I can give you just a little sidebar here. I'm not exact in terms of my numbers, so don't count. But we all have, somewhere around 26,000 genes. And of those 26,000 genes, we probably have about 8,000 that have some relationship to cancer. We would all say that's not why they're there, but whatever the case, they have some relationship. We actually only know how to test about 2,500, but that would only be if we could coordinate every research lab on the planet to work together. As a routine, you can run lab tests in one of the, what I call big five in the US. And on tissue, you can get about 650 targets looking at these genes to determine, are they mutational? And are they helping or hurting? And we can measure somewhere between 80 and 120 from what's called a liquid biopsy, looking at the DNA. And all of that is said to tell you that we only have about 50 drugs that are actually approved. So you can kind of see we started out here at 26,000 to 8,000 to 2,500 to 650, and you can see the problem, right? And I recognize this problem very strongly and early on, saying that we needed to start to build therapies that weren't only using conventional drugs, but would allow for multi-targeting. I have a very, very strong opinion about cancer, that it is not about a bullet or two. It's not about one bullet or two for one bullseye or two, but cancer is a multi-bullseye, dozens and dozens and dozens, whether you want to talk about the extracellular environment, the intracellular environment. There's enormous biology in terms of complexity that needs to be addressed in patients. And it so happens that compounds like curcumin and resveratrol and various agents are somewhat pleiotropic. They have the ability to multi-target. These compounds grow in nature. If we date back to around the 1940s, 1950s, the pharma world was really proud of itself that they could make a pure drug. And a pure drug works somewhat fantastically well for certain kinds of diseases. But when it comes to cancer, actually, we may benefit from drugs that are not so pure, that have the ability to multi-target, since I believe one of the great gaping holes in cancer care, and one of the reasons we haven't been successful, is because we don't methodically, systematically, comprehensively analyze all of what's driving a particular patient's disease, and then methodically go after each and every one of those bullseyes with strategies that don't hurt, that are not overly costly, and that can be bridged with interaction screening with mainstream drugs that have, and will always have far more data behind them because they have far more money to run that type of research.
Oh, that's really helpful, Keith. So could you give us an update on outcomes of your work with circadian health, antioxidants, chemotherapy, and integrative chronochemotherapy with, say, breast cancer survival, both with primary breast cancer and also metastatic? What have you seen over the years with breast cancer, both primary and metastatic, in terms of survival?
So before I get there, let me start where you started in the circadian health. I'm going to do something that's probably inappropriate in a discussion, but
no, that's great.
The diagram. So what this is this is looking at a group of different cancers, actually 5, but we're looking at 2 colorectal cancer study groups. And we're looking at ovarian, lung, non-small cell, renal, kidney, metastatic breast, and 2 colorectal. And this entire study demonstrates that cancer patients with pain on admission demonstrated 4.6 times greater likelihood of dying if their circadian clock was disrupted. And what this is showing is it's showing that the difference of survival of these patients a 20 to 30% difference as to whether or not you are robust in your circadian clock or disrupted. So yes, we actually do a considerable amount of testing with patients. We assess all of our patients' circadian health and then work intensively hard on fixing it. So we also ran a pretty impressive study. It was 30 patients. It was meant to be a pilot study. We used stage 3 and 4 chemotherapy patients with solid tumors from our patient population that had heavily chemotherapy treatment, pre-treatment, even before walking into our door. And we then assessed them in very careful tools that are used in the industry, the Pittsburgh Sleep Questionnaire, the symptoms, EORTC, the ORTS. We looked at quality of life in these patients and survival data. And I just give you a little bit of kind of what I think is really fascinating kind of clinical results with this. The correlation of a better rhythm predicting longer survival. The two, we compared to 3 groups. We compared to a colorectal cancer group that was stage 1 through 3. We looked at a breast cancer population that was stage 1 through 3, compared to our stage 3 and 4 population. And we looked at a healthy population that had no cancer and no serious illness whatsoever. And the 24-hour correlation in terms of rhythm regularity, our group, stage 3, 4, more advanced, was nearly 2-fold better than the 2 cancer groups and comparable to the healthy group. The sleep quality index, the Pittsburgh sleep analysis, we were 60% better than the non-stage 3-4 group. And our symptoms assessment looked at insomnia, appetite loss, and constipation and pain. We matched, I'm going to try to show this to you. I don't know if you'll be able to see that. Okay, so this is us right here. And the first 3 symptoms I told you were 0, 0, 0. And that's exactly what the healthy population. This is the stage 3 and 4 cancer population, advanced cancer population. And these are all zeros, with the healthy population here. So we matched them. These are the 2 earlier stage groups, stage 1 through 3 populations, and they actually suffered significantly symptomatically. Now, I will tell you that pain, our group number was 16.6. The colon was 36.5, more than double. The breast cancer group was 39.0, more than double. The healthy group beat us, 0, but the healthy group didn't have cancer. So we actually are really convinced that the term that's been used, for 100 years, maybe 150 years, a guy by the name of James Coates talked about this many years ago, that one's performance status, one's wellness, really the way we define it today is activities of daily living. It's an inadequate measure, in my opinion, but nonetheless, he talked about this, and many other people have talked about it, that it may be more important our wellness, our resilience in all of these different categories of muscle mass and aerobics and, meditation and breath work and flexibility and, being happy, that foundation may be far more important than what drugs we give somebody.
And that's very profound. And we at Cancer Choices put a very strong emphasis on precisely that, what we call 7 healing practices. We follow you on terrain, on the optimizing terrain So we very strongly support that direction. Sleeping well is one of the key dimensions of seven healing practices. So, so in terms of outcomes, you've just talked about one facet of outcomes, but I think people would like to know if they have breast cancer, let's just take that among many, either primary or metastatic, and they come to the Block Center or do a telephonic consult with you and follow your program closely at home as much as they can. What happens to their quality of life, time to recurrence, and survival?
So we actually had published data around this because I don't have with me right now the prostate one. It's quicker, and I'll give it to you. The breast one is a little more time consuming and I think more valuable to cover. But I do want to tell you, we studied 27 men with metastatic stage 4. At the time, it would have been called stage D2, just different nomenclature, with spread to the bones or other organs. And we studied 27 of them. They all received conventional hormonal therapy as well as other prostate cancer medications. In addition, they all followed our program. We looked at the survival times from the time their metastatic disease was diagnosed. Our numbers would have been way higher if we looked from the time that they were initially diagnosed with, in many cases, an earlier stage prostate cancer. We compared them with 4 different populations of metastatic or more localized prostate cancer groups. The patients at other centers averaged a survival of 30 months. At the Block Center, our patients average a survival of 60 months. In other words, they survived twice as long as the patients treated only with standard conventional medications. 50% of the men were alive 5 years after diagnosis. 20% of them went on to live beyond 10 years. Some of them completely clear, some of them still with active metastatic disease that we were able to control and contain. So we really did pretty well. I mean, it was a pretty impressive kind of impact. Let's talk about breast cancer.
But before you go to breast cancer,
sure.
Prostate cancer, I mean, Dean Ornish did work along similar lines, and there's been work by others. Is it fair to say that among the solid tumors that prostate cancer is sort of the poster child of the cancer that is known to do best with integrative therapies appropriately applied or not? It's always seemed to me that that's the one where one can say with some confidence to prostate cancer patients, this makes a demonstrable difference, and several different researchers have found that to be true. Would you agree with that or not?
I do agree with that, Michael. A very famous physician out of Canada named Ferdinand Labrie, an endocrinologist researcher, studied both prostate and breast cancers when he was alive. And he ran the very first study on flutamide. The drug has evolved into a little bit different, but it was a prostate cancer drug. I was one of 39 U.S. physicians who participated in it. And Labrie said, and even communicated with me about this, that he believed our diet and lifestyle interventions changed our patient load compared to the other 38 physicians dramatically, that they were not pumping adrenaline and steroids and cortisol and chemicals that unfortunately both can be immunosuppressive as well as setting patients up for more aggressive disease. And he felt that the same was true for breast cancer, and that any disease that was influenced by hormones. But I would kind of argue one little step further, and that is that there is a degree of growth stimulation that can occur from almost any kind of hormonal effect that may even just be stress chemistry, even for a tumor that is not, believed to be, highly filled with receptors for, different hormones and things. So, but let me tell you, so this was our breast cancer population. I'll show you, I think I have it around here somewhere. Yeah, I have a visual I'll show you in a second. But so we followed 90 consecutive patients. By the way, this is published in the Breast Journal. Actually, the head of research out of M.D. Anderson in breast cancer for the last many years, a really lovely guy who was running UCSF's breast cancer unit, Dr. Debu Tripathi.
Yeah, we know him well.
Yes.
Wonderful man. Yeah.
Yes, co-authored with us.
Oh, wonderful.
And reviewed all of our data independently. Anyhow, we followed 90 consecutive patients with advanced metastatic breast cancer, diagnosed over a 13-year period. They received from us chronomodulated chemotherapy and very aggressive, not invasive, aggressive, integrative and nutritional treatment. We followed their records and followed them clinically and determined prognostic factors like hormonal receptor status, their conventional treatments, how long they survive from the time they develop metastatic disease. Their median age at the time of metastases was 46 years old, in which many of you probably recognize that this is younger than most breast cancer patients. So our average patient at that time was younger, and it implies a much greater mortality risk. 96% of our patients had relapsed into advanced disease before seeing us. So they were already stage 4 advanced disease before they walked in our doors. We compared their survival with that of breast cancer patients in a few other studies that were comparable to our population. Our 90 advanced breast cancer patient population's median survival was 38 months. Median survival means that's when you're at the 50% mark. 50% of the patients are no longer alive, 50% are. And it's a very stable number used in research statistics. Throughout our study period, the 1990s, the median survival reported in metastatic breast cancer trials generally ranged from 12 to 18 months, with just a couple of studies that went 21, 22, and 23 months. None of them reached our 38 months. Our 5-year survival was 27% from the center, and the comparison groups all added up, matched up to about 17%, despite a higher proportion of younger and relapsed patients, a much more advanced group. So for advanced and younger patients with thus a higher risk and a worse expected prognosis, our patients in the study even today in 2023 have still among the best survivals for advanced metastatic breast cancer. This is actually that data. A little hard to see. The median survival is right here, and that's how you kind of determine off of a Kaplan-Meier the 38-month median survival in this patient population. This is us, and each one of these is colored based on what the metastatic site was, or the couple of metastatic sites. Green is bone, lung is blue, liver, and visceral. And you can see the other groups that we looked at. The Munich group, right where my finger is the SEER data. It's the major data that's used as comparison across the globe and has for many decades now. There was a Louisiana group and a Texas group as well. And you can see it even when you match up to the particular metastatic site, none of them come close to the survival of our patient population.
That's
You would think
extraordinary.
you would think it would have been easy for us to have gotten funded by various institutions and stuff after this kind of data. Not the case whatsoever. Just so you know, 3-year survival percentages on the group that 9% were alive in one of the trials, one of the groups that I just showed you, 28% in another, and 30% in the Louisiana group. And our group was 52%. So we pretty much came close to doubling the rest of the population with that. This is really one of those patients. She's still alive today. She's out since 1999. So she's 24 years out. She's alive and well and free of disease, and has done very well, and still stays in close contact with us.
So Keith, if that's true, if that's true for prostate cancer and breast cancer, including metastatic breast cancer, what about the implications for the other so-called fat-related cancers like colon and ovarian? In other words, are those two poster children for a broader set of solid tumors that are epidemiologically said to be fat-related or industrial civilization related?
I believe so. If you look at the research, doesn't matter whether you're looking at preclinical research or clinical research, I think, the data supports it. Unfortunately, you have to run the trials to, really prove it. And this is not an arena that is well funded.
What about blood cancers?
Different. I would tell you that there's a complete different approach that one would take for, say, childhood leukemias and different childhood cancers than adults. I work with a large number of CLL patients, chronic lymphocytic lymphoma or leukemia. And as many of you may or may not know, CLL over time morphs into SLL, small lymphocytic lymphoma. So it starts off as a blood cancer, and it slowly morphs into kind of a lymph cancer that is more solid. And I actually believe very strongly that the biology is very similar, not in the early stages, but in the later stages. And our responses with patients seem to follow a very similar kind of pattern that we see with solid tumors.
But broadly speaking, would you say you do as well with blood cancers as you do with the solid tumors, or is there a difference in what you see?
So we don't actually see until late in the game some of the really crisis-related acute lymphoblastic types of lymphomas, and some of these patients will come into our door under the guise that they thought they had, some kind of blood disorder, and we didn't know what it was. And I can remember, practically putting a patient into my car and driving them to Northwestern to a colleague of mine because the patient needed acute therapy in a unit, right away. And the patient's still alive. That was about 15 years ago. So not all cancers are all blood cancers are kind of easy to treat in an outpatient clinical setting. But I brought up chronic lymphocytic leukemia because my experience has grown considerably. A gentleman who wrote a book and acknowledges me as his doctor. The book is called N of One, and his name is Glenn C.
Yeah, important book.
Yes, and so we designed an entire regimen and really did a full analysis on CLL along with one of my research staff, Charlotte, did a very deep dive, and we did a really full analysis on all the mechanisms and targets that CLL uses before we introduced a full program for him. It didn't reverse his disease for about 15 months. It took a while, but he eventually completely reversed his disease. And in the book, he acknowledges his probably at least for a number of years, if not still today, a Dr. Nadler, Dana-Farber, possibly the best funded researcher in CLL in the world. And he acknowledged that Glenn's case to him appears as if he has cured his disease, that there's no evidence of disease, and that he had never really actually seen that before. I actually have a number of patients that we've been able to put into remission with CLL, but these things are always, they require a certain degree of humility and humbleness, and yet I'm not so sure that that's how you get funded. I think sometimes you need to be really aggressive and have the right people, barking for you, because the rule in the institutional world, and particularly when you get into the National Cancer Institute and stuff, and it's kind of a cute statement, is, I first, the guys who are making the decisions about whether they fund, I first fund myself, I then fund my students, I then fund my friends, and if there's any money left over, you may get something. And I can tell you that's pretty much accurate and true from my personal experience. So anyway.
You mentioned the importance of chronomodulated chemotherapy. And the last time I visited you, which was 20 years ago or so, you were talking about that. And my memory, correct me if I'm wrong, is that chronomodulated chemotherapy actually is fairly common in some parts of Europe, but almost unknown in the United States. That was my last update on it. How do you use it today? Why does it make a difference? And are we making any progress? Because it's so powerful and in terms of quality of life and the ability to stay well as you receive targeted chronomodulated chemotherapy.
So, for the audience that doesn't know, chronotherapy or chronomodulated chemotherapy started off by one gentleman that ended up running research out of VA hospitals in the U.S. It was his idea. His name is Dr. William Reshevsky, and Bill worked within VA hospitals, first did enormously difficult work. This is pre-computer era with mice. As you may or may not appreciate, mice are running around your kitchen when you're asleep, and you're running around the kitchen when they're asleep. And so after all that data was done with different cancer drugs and stuff to determine what was the optimal window on a 24-hour clock, when's the drug the most effective and when is it the least toxic, they had to take all that data and flip it because of the mouse versus human issue. And then they had to rerun all of these studies. And these studies actually grew in the chemo window, and the VA hospitals pretty much ran out of money in the early 2000s. And so a lot of our targeted drugs we don't have, but we do have, because of one of the students of Reshevsky's went back to Europe, and he did some really brilliant work with immunotherapies as well. So we know pretty much the chemotherapy world and the immunotherapy world, how to time these drugs. But it's not just what time of day or night a drug is given, it's also the style of the infusion. So the style of infusion, the analogy I'll use is frogs and boiling water. You drop frogs in boiling water, they jump to save their skin. You drop cancer cells in a pool of high concentrated chemotherapy, they shut their pores, they congregate, and they go to sleep. They go dormant to save their skin. What the routine is in cancer care is to give a bolus dose all at once or a high concentration drip. Cancer cells aren't stupid. They do just what I said. They close and they go dormant. What we do instead is we start with a tiny trickle of drug. And as we give that little bit of drug, it actually agitates cells, and they start gobbling drug at 40 to 100 times the rate of a normal cell. One bite normal cell, 40 to 100 with the cancer cell. One bite. And what we do is we slowly ratchet up. We use special technology, special pumps to deliver the drug, and we ratchet it up, 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 up in that same sinusoidal curve that actually, you might argue that frogs in boiling water, use, and he has a terrible analogy, but it works. You can kind of get the idea. It so happens that we get somewhere as much as a 80% drop in adverse effects. I have two almost identical colon cancer stories, both East Coast patients in major cancer centers. One could not tolerate drugs any longer, had a relative as an oncologist and agreed, stop and put him in hospice. The other one, the therapy completely failed the patient. Both came to us. I show slides sometimes with one of them jogging on a treadmill on his last cycle of treatment in complete remission with no evidence of disease. The other one, we actually had one recurrence about 2 years later. This is a 2007 diagnosis, and fully got him with no evidence of disease, recurred, got him back into no evidence of disease again, and he's been fine now for whatever that is, approximately 15 plus years with it. And so we know that it cuts toxicity in a major way. I actually have a study attached here. It improves treatment response, treatment outcome, but fascinatingly, we can re-challenge patients with the same drugs and the same doses that failed the patient previously and give them back. And 50% of the time, the literature says, this is not just my experience, the patients will respond, and they'll respond terrifically to it. The top of this is the sinusoidal curve of the infusion, and we use these very special pumps with a considerable amount of complexity in terms of technology. The whole staff, everybody has to be on the same page, the pharmacist, tubing, the works to be able to do it. You won't be able to see this very well here. I'll kind of read it to you. This is an ovarian cancer study, metastatic ovarian cancer trial. And these patients had a 50% reduction in complications when the drugs were given at the right time and in the right style of infusion. They had an 80% reduction in the need to reduce the dose. So what's relevant about that is that we know that when cancer patients have to reduce their doses, it's well documented, patients do far, far worse. And so this is demonstrating that chrono allowed the patients to maintain optimal dosing. But what was really impressive is this number here. These patients, their 5-year survivals, 4 times as many patients were alive that received the chronotherapy versus the group that did not. So
just extraordinary. So there's so many things we can cover, Keith, and I will continue to bring my parts in. But as we hit the top of the hour with a half hour left for questions, I want to bring in a number. Deb Cohan, our friend and colleague, physician extraordinary physician, says, I'd love to hear Dr. Block's opinion about Nasha Winter's metabolic approach to cancer that encourages relatively high-fat keto diet versus what you just said about less than 20%. So I know it's sometimes hard to talk about other practitioners, but is there any comment that you can make on her approach?
I won't comment about her or her approach.
Yeah.
I will comment on keto. I mentioned terrain earlier, this microenvironment that cancer cells reside in. And I kind of want you to know that we know that mitogens drive growth. Sugar, white flour, nicotine, alcohol, emotional distress, sleep disruption, etc. We also know that mutagens drive growth, damage to DNA. And we all have damage to DNA. There's research out of the National Cancer Database where a rather large couple million Americans were followed with extraordinary detail in terms of analyzing everything, including their lifestyle habits and eating patterns and everything else. And they found that the patients that had saturated fat intake that was approximately the top third of that patient population that they were analyzing had a 45% to 50% increase in mortality. The middle group was the middle group. The lower group was a group that mostly ate a diet that was either vegan, pescatarian vegan, kind of leaning away from meats, poultry, and dairy products, in many cases completely. And that population dropped mortality by 65% or greater. So you have 115% difference going up 45 or 50% versus coming down 65 plus percent. I would also argue that there's several different studies that have been done that really are in the face of keto diets. But I'll be careful to acknowledge scientifically, you can take ketones. You can take beta hydroxybutyrate. You can take supplements and compounds. And there is preclinical research, animal research, that shows that in at least some studies, giving ketones, not changing the diet, actually does have a therapeutic effect. I would agree with the biggest concern that I think is why there are patients who seem to do better temporarily or with certain cancers. Blocking glycemia, controlling hyperinsulinemia is a very significant factor. And most of the time when people have shifted their diets toward a more high protein and high fat diet, they've done it with a strong goal of trying to contain hyperinsulinemia and glycemia, kind of a Warburg effect. And that biology is quite impressive and significant. And I think that there is a role for containment and control from this regard. I do. And I think that there may be a role with ketone bodies and taking it in a healthy way, but I don't think that you can eat a diet that's high in saturated fat. There's considerable evidence in the face of doing a high animal protein, particularly a high saturated fat based diet.
So let me go to the most basic question. Imagine someone on a limited income, but they have a real sense of agency, and they want to know what they can do at home. Let's just say for a solid tumor, breast, prostate, colon, ovarian, whatever. And they want to know what your basic rules of thumb are for the priorities that a person who may not be able to come to your center, may not be able to afford a consult, but what are the basic priorities that you would want patients with solid tumors to know to move in that direction to take an integrative approach to care?
Honestly, without sounding like I'm trying to sell books, Life Over Cancer will cover really the core issues that I think and that we as a full team here think is essential to getting kind of the right foundation in place. And that foundation is really an optimal diet. It is unquestionably maintaining muscle. If you become Hercules, you do not get a better immune system. But if you atrophy, you do lose your immune system. So we exercise patients, whether they're, in fact, we kind of really push patients right before they get chemotherapy bags or any kind of cancer, drugs hung, that they become very active in this regard. And we keep those patients active while they're getting treated. I don't have the photo in front of me at this point, but I have a rollerblader patient of ours that we'd hook a fanny pack onto her with her chemotherapy running, and she would go rollerblading around the lake near Northwestern, if you know Evanston at all. This other, kind of piece of this, besides muscle maintenance and aerobic competence, is, a full foundation of managing kind of biobehavioral care and sleep and circadian health, and getting that foundation right. And along with that, getting that metabolic environment so it is cancer fighting and not cancer promoting. But even then, I am, of the very strong opinion that we have to still multi-target the intracellular glitches that occur normally in us. I'm not even dealing with kind of genetic glitches in terms of mutations, but there is a great deal of work that we have been doing that demonstrates that you can influence these mutagenic actions that actually drive cell proliferation in quite dramatic ways. And so we've got, a couple of patients right now that have been under our care for several years now. They both were in trials when they finally came to us. The trials, virtually once the patients fail a trial, and it's all bad language because a trial fails a patient. Patients don't fail trials. And these patients came under our care. In both situations, one of them, about 150 patients in the trial, the other one, well over 400 patients in the trial. They're the only two patients still alive. There's not a single patient in either of those trials still alive with it. And so I think we're missing the boat of how important getting this foundation is, that it's not just nice. It's not just about feeling better and living better. It's really very deeply about these things play a major role in getting better. And then when you put that all together, with it, we still need innovation, right? Whether it's chronotherapy, whether it's the hyperbaric oxygen therapy that we use here with patients to counter adverse effects, but also to augment cell sensitivity to drugs, whether it is repurposed drugs, off-label drugs, not just a kitchen sink approach, which is sort of throwing, drugs at a patient because they may have this mechanism or that mechanism, but rather deep analysis of what are their bullseyes, what are the unique bullseyes that are driving their disease that we can go after, and then methodically, selectively, specifically to that patient, multi-targeting. And at least our preliminary work in this regard is eye-popping. It's really basketball-sized goosebumps, and it's quite exciting about what may be possible. At the same time that I say that, there is really awesome things going on around the planet in terms of cancer work that I think is going to break in the next 3, 4 to 12 years. And I think it will transform this disease completely, the way that we see it. And some of it is really exceptionally brilliant minds that have put together. Some of it is really just a light bulb that went off in somebody at the right moment, and they were able to pull, the team together to really kind of move things forward. I think many of you are probably aware of the plant enzyme and the two plant biologists that got Nobel Prizes in 2020, in October 2020, for CRISPR, and this plant enzyme that will edit our DNA. Walter Isaacson wrote a book called The Code Breaker about the senior one of them, and just how extraordinary this is, and what the potential really is for us as a population when these kinds of scientific breakthroughs are used for good purposes.
I'm going to ask Laura Pohl, my colleague and oncology nurse and researcher, to join us online here. And I just want to acknowledge there are quite a few detailed questions about what information you keep in your database, how to decide what supplements to take. I would refer people to your book, Life Over Cancer, for a lot of the detailed information.
And I would refer people to Commonweal, to your website. Having participated a bit in getting it together, there's really a amazing, wonderful, considerably valuable information on that website.
Well, thank you so much, Keith. We're very honored by that. We have 10,000 hours of work into it, and we cancerchoices.org, our database of supplements and repurposed drugs and things like that is very considerable and growing. Laura, as we begin to close, do you have a key question for Keith or comment that you'd like to ask?
Yes, Keith, I wanted to ask you about novel, and some of this is not so novel anymore, but testing. For instance, in your book, you talk quite a bit about chemosensitivity testing. We find that a lot of patients get it done, and then their oncologist won't pay attention to the results, at least not if this is early stage and there are some protocols that they have to use first. Could you comment on testing and where you all are with that and what sort of testing you do?
I'll point out that there are a lot of new chemosensitivity types of approaches popping up all over the globe. But I would give credit to Robert Nagurney, a dear friend, initially just a colleague. I was very interested in chemosensitivity testing in their early days, and his partner at that time, Larry Weisenthal, and they both evolved a model. It had some rough beginnings because of some knowledge that we didn't have scientifically at the time, between, whether you should be doing an assay, a laboratory assay to look at, apoptosis, programmed cell death, or look at, blocking cell birth, anti-proliferative assays. But I have had such impressive results with, and I just because of a long-term friendship and stuff, I'm very much involved with Robert and his center. I have a bias. It's not a disclosure, though. I wrote the foreword to his book because I have had patients that came to us, sometimes 4 or 5 courses of different chemo, unsuccessful, and then sent, fresh tissue to him and implemented the regimens and completely nailed it. I mean, just jaw-dropping, really impressive with it. And his data, I think, would claim, at least some of the early published data, that he has about a 200% better chance of a doctor pulling the right drugs than the way we physicians use population statistics to determine a regimen. So I'm a real fan of this, and do have a strong bias, but I do respect and have been looking at a bunch of the newer types of technology that are coming out. And some of them have some early data that looks very promising. I would only kind of give a heads up to patients that you can't do most chemosensitivity testing after the surgery. It has to be planned preoperative so that patients have the kits in hand and their doctors, their surgeons actually brought it to the operating room, or you carried it yourself there, and that you have the logistics all laid out so that you can, these things often have to be packed in ice and overnight it and arrive not on a Friday afternoon, et cetera. So, I'm a real fan.
Yeah, great. And if there's time, I'd like to ask a little more about the chronomodulated chemo. I know you have consulted with a few people who didn't come to your clinic, but they were starting chemo and they had some suggestions of what time of day to take their chemo and such. How have you seen conventional clinics, if they're pushed, be able to successfully do this to some degree? No,
and the reason is that the first thing is that I believe a lot of the literature on chrono is in places unfavorable and controversial because patients get the drug at the right time or the right window, but they don't get it based on a sinusoidal wave curve. And that difference is quite significant in terms of what happens with patients. We have some examples where patients actually received their drugs at the right time, and it didn't work. And then they came here and we did the same thing over again, but this time we did it in full using pumps that allow for the administration and delivery to be optimized, and completely different results with patients. I have a fascinating story of a patient that during the pandemic is a patient who's been under our care now for over 8 years with a very aggressive pancreatic cancer and adenocarcinoma of pancreas with extensive metastatic disease. And this patient knew about us and came to us up front, has done everything, kind of to the letter. And we've been able to completely contain her disease up until without giving away too much, during the beginning of the pandemic in the United States, people couldn't fly out of certain locations, and she was unable to fly. We had her stable on the same exact regimen, which we still have her on today. My colleagues say that's not possible. We have never developed resistance with her. Now, we do give her certain IV nutritional and oral agents as well as chronomodulation. And we also give her, some off-label drugs and stuff, all aimed at, keeping these drugs sensitive. She's never developed resistance. When she went home, we arranged same drugs, same dosing, but virtually nothing other than the oral agents that we could send with her. She wasn't able to get anything else. She was bedridden between her FOLFIRINOX regimen for 12 days out of every 14. And the only 2 days that she was out of her house was when she was at the clinic getting the chemos. Several weeks went by before they were able to fly again. She was ready to quit chemo. And as she said, she was ready to, accept whatever happened to her, from a life-saving perspective, because the same drugs and the same doses made her that ill. She came back here from the very first cycle we started her back on. She's totally fine.
Wow.
Yeah. And she has, talk about travel, for that's extensive travel to Chicago virtually every 2 weeks for essentially 2 days of care. So.
Well, thank you.
As we enter our last, thank you, Laura. And as we enter our last 10 minutes, I want to go to the larger questions that you and I have faced for many, many years. You mentioned that you have not been able to get significant research money from the government. And also, in prior conversations, I know that the whole system of reimbursement for your clinic and so forth, in terms of the cost of chemotherapy drugs, there are many factors that make it difficult for you to sustain this work. And I just want to reflect together on why it is that there's so much evidence, not just from you or me, but from Wayne Jonas and all kinds of other people who have devoted their lives to this, that integrative or whole person cancer care, well done, improves quality of life, increases time to recurrence, extends life in so many cases. It offers so much. And yet, in the face of a great deal of science and a great deal of clinical experience, it is very hard to get beyond the kind of integrative care light models where a few feel-good things are offered, but there is no real integration of the very skillful use of conventional therapies, because there's a lot of overtreatment as well. The skillful use of conventional therapies, the kind of work Mark Renneker does, our colleague, in helping people find, medically sound cancer therapies that are not part of the standard of care, but nonetheless are doing dramatically good work, both in different parts of the country and around the world. So there is a level of I don't know if I'd say frustration or dumbfoundedness or what word we would use, that here a whole community of us have devoted 40 years or more to developing a body of work. And yet, at the level at which it really makes a difference, it's very hard to move that out to more cancer patients. What are your reflections on the state of the effort to make integrative or whole person care accessible to a much wider range of people with cancer?
It's so interesting that, as you're talking, I'm flashing on centers in your backyard, in my backyard, in the southwestern United States, in the northeastern United States, that are funded centers that, in my experience and observation, are totally disconnected, even though you might have to walk through the parking lot to find them, but they're right alongside the hospital. They're funded to be working with the hospital, and yet there's no crosstalk whatsoever. Equally surprising to me, Mark is, creating with his patient advocate population, a group of doctors who can do, in the future moving ahead, what Mark has been doing for several decades, which is totally extraordinary work, as you and I both have observed and witnessed. But when I have put out feelers for several years trying to find physicians that want to do what I do, that I could train, they either don't exist, or the ones that come in don't have a work ethic or don't have the commitment of, this area, which is, it's more than a full-time job. You have to pretty much embrace and live it, to really get good at it, because it is complex and it is significant. But I believe very strongly that we need conferences, we need, and unfortunately, many of the societies that do set up are carrying the same burden that these centers that get set up, without mentioning names, and some centers, they're allowed to use vitamin D in a mushroom, and that's the extent of the supplementation that they do. Some centers, do some, soft music therapy and, a few other, kind of areas of meditation. I am not knocking those as therapies. Please hear me. But the lack of diving in and really committing to something that has such profound effects on people's lives and quality of life, let alone quantity of life, let alone buying the edge that can get them over the hurdle and actually reverse a disease, is extraordinary to me. And it's extraordinary to me that you and I could know each other since I believe it was like 1985. And we are having the same conversation we were having then. And the institutional world has been able to, in many ways, prevent the evolution of this and to incorporate it. And I'm sorry to say this, but I actually believe I'm better off growing our operation as almost independent centers in different locations, as opposed to trying to go into a hospital and deal with, all of the different boards that, say, no, we can't do that. No, we can't do that. And don't respect the knowledge and the experience that I believe it takes to really get these kinds of results.
Well, as we come to a close here, Keith, I just want to express the depth of the debt that we owe to you and your research and your clinical work. The partnership that we've had with you, Mark Reneker, and many other colleagues that came together for many years at Commonweal and continue to be in touch with each other. This is God's work, and it's a blessing that you have led so much of it for so many decades, and we just couldn't be more grateful to you for your partnership and colleagueship. And may we continue the struggle and hold the vision that because it is true that integrative or whole person cancer care improves quality of life, improves the terrain, improves time to recurrence, improves survival, prevents recurrence. Because these things are true, I want to believe that someday it will be widely available and that our community will continue to advocate and do the work until it is. So I just thank you so much for being with us today at Cancer Choices and at the New School at Commonweal.
Well, amen. And thank you, Michael, and for all of the work that you have done over the years and the extraordinary organization. And I can't even imagine how many people have gone through the Commonweal Self-Help, program and have seen, many of those patients over the years. And it's really profound and wonderful to almost recognize a language that you and Commonweal, and I think those of us who have been so fortunate to be able to be involved in such a community have really experienced and witnessed.
Thank you, Keith. And now I'll turn it back over to Kira Epstein.
Thanks, Michael. And thank you, Keith, and also Laura. Just a remarkable conversation, and will be a wonderful resource for our communities when we get the recordings posted. And as a reminder, if you want to rewatch or share this conversation, if you follow the New School feeds on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, you'll be notified when the recordings are posted. And one more reminder that we have a whole series of Cancer Choices co-presented conversations, and you can find them all on our media sites. Thank you so much, all of you, for being with us at the New School at Commonweal today, and we'll see you next time.
Don't take it, don't take it, don't take it, don't take it, don't Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't.
The river is a healer. The river is a sage. The river knows no end, and the river feels no way.